The COVID-19 pandemic is leaving behind a trail of devastating consequences for our national economy. And it has plunged Australia into recession for the very first time in 30 years. The higher education sector has not been left unscathed and has been likened to being struck by a bolt of lightning and shaken to its core. The pandemic is almost certainly the biggest and the most unexpected disruptor ever experienced in our post-war history. This prompts the question, is COVID-19 the wake-up call for the higher education sector? Is the time opportune for a significant shift of paradigm to ensure the sustainability of some of Australia's oldest and most conservative universities, some of which have resisted change for so long? Or will they sadly continue to remain imprisoned within the ivory tower of academia and face eventual extinction? Will the glass be viewed as being half full or half empty? To answer the vexed question of what is the future for higher education in Australia, I'm in conversation today with the Vice Chancellor and President of La Trobe University, Victoria, Professor John Dewar, AO. Professor Dewar, welcome to Rotary Melbourne. We thank you for this opportunity. I must hasten to clarify that the questions that follow refer to the Australian education sector in general and are not specific to La Trobe University. Please bear with me, as some of the questions have been contextualized for the benefit of our members. We would welcome your personal views or indeed general views in your capacity as Deputy Chair of Universities Australia, member of the EXCO of the Australian Higher Education Industrial Association, and as Director of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China. We would also welcome comparisons based on your prior experience within the universities in the United Kingdom. My next question is about the dominant role of China within the university system. Earlier this year, many key federal institutions became victims of cybersecurity attacks, allegedly by Chinese intelligence agencies. This week alone has already seen yet another low point in the Australia-China diplomatic relationships, with tit-for-tat retaliatory actions against journalists and academics. Many Australian universities have entered into various innovation and technology sharing agreements, particularly with China. There is growing concern that dozens of Australian academics have been recruited into programs such as China's 1,000 Talents program and have strong research collaborations with universities such as Hangzhou DNC and Xidian University, both of which specialize in military defense research. There is also concern that Australian-funded research is serving the national interest of China, as under Chinese law, inventions and patents have to be registered in China. Confucius Institutes were once viewed as the Chinese version of the British Council or Alliance Française, and were meant to promote the learning of the Chinese language through public diplomacy. There is now a view, however, that Confucius Institutes are now being used for mass surveillance rather than public diplomacy. In a recent study, again by CIS, Sydney, it is stated as follows: now that China has tilted towards full-blown totalitarianism at home and military expansionism abroad, the values transfer rationale for engagement with China has evaporated. The expulsion of the human rights activist Drew Pavlov from UQ was seen as stifling dissent and obstructing freedom of speech, and is a matter that has gained international condemnation. Former Defence Chief Dennis Richardson has claimed that universities have become a point of vulnerability that needs to be closed. The FBI has described this as economic espionage, which could jeopardize the Five Eyes Defense Intelligence Cooperation Alliance. Universities are due to come under the watchful eye of the Australian Foreign Relations Bill if they are seen to be compromising national security. So has the time come for our universities to close these Confucius institutes and end their academic and research collaborations with Chinese universities?
You're asking some very well-researched questions here, Suresh. Look, I'll answer your question directly and then give you the reasons for it. The answer is no, absolutely not. Australia and China have been working together in the research domain for many years now. My university's connections into China go back at least to the 1970s. These have been very productive and very important relationships, both for our researchers and for our students. Particularly as China has invested more heavily in its universities and in its research sector, it's become more important actually for Australian researchers to continue to be able to work freely with their Chinese collaborators. Because Australian governments do not have anything like the financial capacity to invest that the Chinese government does. That said, there are obvious risks. The challenge we face is getting the balance right between enabling good, productive research collaborations to take place that have nothing to do with military equipment or facial recognition or suppression of minorities, but which actually benefit humanity as a whole. And I could think of lots of examples of collaborations between my university and other universities with Chinese researchers that would fall into that hugely beneficial character in the fields of drug research, agriculture. There's a whole range of areas where there's a lot of very productive research collaboration going on. There's no doubt that there have been some instances where there are legitimate suspicions that IP is being stolen or repatriated to China in inappropriate circumstances or without the knowledge of the university whose staff generated them. There have been instances of cyber attack, you're right, but frankly, none of that has yet been proven to have been the responsibility of the Chinese. The big one on the ANU, for example, we still don't know, well, there's been no public statement about who was behind that. So I think we need to separate out the facts here and the real risks from what can sometimes become a rather loud and, I have to say, ill-informed public debate about this. Universities are already subject to numerous safeguards and controls to avoid the sort of things we're talking about. So for some time, we've had a thing called the Defence Trade Controls Act, which requires universities to identify where there might be risks of misuse of Australian university IP derived from research. So, for example, it's legislation designed to avoid nuclear technology falling into the wrong hands. Now, that legislation's been around for quite a while. It's been reviewed regularly, and I think is considered to be a fit-for-purpose piece of legislation. It's doing its job reasonably well, I think, and presumably government thinks, because it's still there and is still being reviewed. On top of that, we've had a voluntary task force, of which I was a member, established between the federal government and the university sector to draw up some voluntary guidelines to avoid and manage the risks of foreign interference in universities. And that can take a whole range of forms, not just theft of intellectual property, but as you were suggesting before, surveillance of students, or attempts to interfere with curriculum and such like. Now, those foreign interference guidelines are probably, well, they're considered to be world leading, in that it's the first time a university sector and a government has sat down and tried to work out what the rules should be to ensure that foreign interference doesn't happen. And I can tell you that every university takes this very seriously indeed. And there is one very good reason why they do. And that is because if universities were not cyber secure, if they were not capable of dealing with IP theft, then they would find very few research partners keen to work with them, particularly the Australian government, which, particularly through its defence arm, is a big research partner for Australian universities. So again, the idea that universities are going off and doing crazy things because it's in their financial interest to do so, and inadvertently selling a lot of secrets to China is just wrong. Now, it is a problem, there's no doubt. And the 1,000 Talents program that you mentioned, that's a very difficult thing to deal with, particularly when you're not really familiar with the extent of it. But essentially that involves researchers in universities around the world, not just in Australia, signing agreements with the Chinese government that means that they will agree to do certain things for someone other than their primary employer. Now, some universities have employment arrangements that prevent that, others don't, and those that don't will be looking very carefully at their employment arrangements for the future. As you say, there is now such a deterioration in diplomatic relations between the two countries and it's not just journalists, by the way, Suresh, it's also academics. So just today, and today is the 10th of September, there was a report in the Australian newspaper of an academic called Chen Hong, who's been denied a visa. He comes to Australia regularly. He's well known to my university. He's an academic at one of our key partner universities in Shanghai, the East China Normal University. He's an Australia expert. He loves Australia. But for some reason, the Australian government has decided that they don't want him to return. So universities are getting caught up in this directly now. And I really hope that in doing so, we are able to maintain that careful balance between protecting and enabling the important, the valuable, the productive research that makes the world better for everyone. And we don't throw that baby out with the bathwater of the bad stuff. The researchers whose IP ends up in the wrong hands, that does end up being used to oppress racial minorities or going into military hardware. It's not easy, absolutely not easy. And I think we're much more aware of the risks now than we were. But I think the final point I'd make, Suresh, is that a lot of the media point fingers at universities and say, well, it's all your fault. We're getting accustomed to this. Universities seem to cop the blame for a lot of things. But it was until relatively recently that governments of all stripes actively promoted partnerships and relationships with China. It was seen as a good thing. Now, suddenly, it's no longer seen as a good thing, and yet all of the relationships that universities built when it was seen as a good thing are now seen as, the universities acting irresponsibly. So I think we just need to bear all of that in mind as well. So again, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't a problem, Suresh, but I do think the existing legislative and voluntary frameworks, as well as the risk management and mitigation processes that universities have in place, are well designed to deal with this. I am very worried about the Foreign Relations Bill. I think it will catch a lot of desirable research collaboration in a very unproductive way. I'm really worried about it, and so is the whole sector. Now, so there's a debate still to be had about that legislation, and we may yet see changes. But in terms of what I've seen so far, it's very concerning.
Thank you. I've got a couple of lesser questions or less questions. Let's look at mass casualization and exploitation.
Yeah.
It has been alleged that some universities, 73% of staff are in insecure work or on casual or short-term contracts. La Trobe is not far behind at 70%.
I'm going to dispute that figure, Suresh. I'm going to dispute that figure, but you go on.
Yeah. These trends have been described as the industry's dirty secret. The University of Melbourne has recently repaid 1,500 academics in what was described as a wage theft scandal of underpayment. And the NTEU calls these systemic problems and a national disgrace. How widespread is this problem? Has it tarnished the reputation of our universities and eroded public trust?
So I think there are two slightly different issues in this, Suresh. One is the question of what's called wage theft or paying people the wrong amount or not enough. And the other is the extent of casualization itself.
Yeah.
Now that figure of 70% that you've cited for my universities includes not just casuals, so people who are hired on a semester by semester basis, but it includes all of our fixed term staff. So people who are on fixed term contracts of anything between 1 and 5 years duration. Now I think there's a big difference between someone who's casually employed semester to semester and someone who's on a fixed term contract. And in fact, if you disaggregate those two categories, you'll find that La Trobe is actually has one of the lowest proportions of casual staff and a higher proportion of fixed term staff. And that's because we have deliberately shifted as many staff as we can from casual to fixed term, because we think that provides them with a bit more certainty of security of tenure. Casualization is a product of two things, I think. Well, maybe three things. One is the uncertainty in our student numbers. And a lot of this goes back to the rapid growth in international students. You talked about mitigating risk. One of the ways you mitigate risk is not to expose yourself too much to employing too many staff on a continuing basis. So actual casualization has become a form of a risk mitigation strategy for universities who are fearful of sudden downturns in international student recruitment. It's a workforce that you can sort of shift up and down as needed. The second driver, if you like, of casualization are the terms and conditions that apply to our continuing staff. And these have been built up over many years through successive collective bargaining rounds. But the net result is that it's incredibly expensive to make an academic, a staff member, or indeed any continuing staff member at a university redundant. It's incredibly expensive. Redundancy payments in universities are now way, way above anything you'd see elsewhere in the economy. So there is a very strong disincentive for universities to expand their continuing workforce until they're absolutely certain that they will have continuing work for those people to do. That's why, again, you see a significant reliance on a casual workforce. And I know that the issue of casualization is often portrayed as the growth of a precarious workforce, the precariat, and to some extent that's true. But don't forget that a lot of our casual tutors are also PhD students. In fact, we'd think maybe as much as half of our casual tutors are students whose primary purpose in life is to do a PhD and who are picking up some casual work on the side as a way of earning a bit of extra money. And they welcome that. They would much rather that than have any larger employment commitment, which would be incompatible with their continuation of their PhD studies. Now, that's not to deny that there is a group of casual staff who would much rather have some greater form of tenure. I don't deny that. And they will be eligible to apply for continuing jobs when they arise in university. Sadly, that's not going to be very likely in the foreseeable future. But it's important to understand the dynamics within the sector of what drives this level of casualisation. I don't like it, I must say. I'd much rather we were able to employ more staff, and that's one reason why we've put as many of our casuals onto fixed term as we can. But we have to operate within the system as it is. On the question of so-called wage theft, most of this, I think, it's hard to know whether this is conscious and deliberate or just the function of the complexity of university payroll systems, which are very complex beasts. My sense is that this is as much a case of local heads of school, heads of department, incorrectly classifying the work that someone is doing, rather than a deliberate underpayment of someone for work that they know they should be paid more for. Now, I may be wrong in that. And I know that the union would claim that this is deliberate and that there is systematic underpayment of casual staff. I'd be surprised if that was more than an isolated example, but I may be wrong. At my university, we have put very rigorous processes in place around our payroll system to make sure that we are paying people what they deserve to be paid. But even there, in the end, you're relying on the local head of school or the head of department to say, this person should be employed to do X, when in fact, they're being employed really to do Y, which is paid more. So it's a complex picture, but I hope I've conveyed a sense of why casualization is there, and then that not in every case, it's not a bad thing in every case.
Thank you. My next question is around something that's of great interest to me, and it's very exciting for the future of Victoria, the North and West City deal. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in recent months, 60% of COVID cases have been in this region, and an estimated 80,000 jobs have been lost. Now, La Trobe's vision of a city of the future, which includes an ambitious $5 billion investment over the next 10 years and includes educational facilities for 40,000 students, housing for 12,000 students, a health and well-being hub, a world-class sports park, and a research and innovation precinct, which could potentially create 20,000 new jobs, is certainly something that Victorians should welcome. However, Australia is currently experiencing economic coercion with respect to the exports of its barley, beef, and wine to China. Could a potentially significant drop in international, particularly Chinese students, make such an ambitious project justifiable? And with higher education migrating to online modes of delivery, has COVID-19 affected these plans? And if not, then how does La Trobe expect to make this project viable and recover its return on investment?
Thank you. Look, thank you for that question. And you're right, the Northwest City deal is a great initiative. It will, if it's successful, it will yield significant infrastructure investment for areas of Melbourne that have been sadly neglected over many years. And of course, as you say, we're right in the heart of it, in Bundoora in particular. So it's dear to our hearts and very, a significant step forward if it were to come about. To answer your question about our university city of the future, is it still relevant? Absolutely. We see the role of a university and of La Trobe in particular in the north of Melbourne as being all about doing everything we can to create employment, opportunity, and vibrancy in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And we have one of our great endowments when we were established back in 1967 is that we were given a huge amount of land, 230 hectares, which is bigger than Melbourne's CBD. So not only is this an asset for the university, it's an asset for the community. We've been working on the master plan for this campus for about the last 5 years. And all the way through, we've been absolutely determined to ensure that not only should it work for the university, but it must work for the community. So in our thinking about the activities that we want to encourage there, the first one is sport. You mentioned the sports park, and that's already borne fruit through the announcement of the funding of the feasibility study for the siting of the home of the Matildas, the Rugby Victoria Centre of Excellence, and the Football Victoria headquarters, which will be on our site. So that just further adds to the activity that will happen on that campus, the extent of community involvement, and the focus on elite sport and teaching and research associated with it. We also want to create a health and wellbeing precinct, as you said. We're working very closely with a number of partners to ensure that that happens, and I'm quite confident, actually, that something very exciting will happen before long in the health and wellbeing space. We also want to generate more commercial and retail and entertainment activity to give it a feel of being a bit of a centre, a town within a suburb, if you like. That might be harder, you're right, that could be harder in the immediate future because there's just going to be less investment around to put into office space or retail space. You know, those things might well change as a result of COVID. The thinking about how we build space in a suburban or urban setting. So, you know, but we'll respond to whatever the market tells us in that, and we're working very closely with some property advisors to identify the right development partners for us. We do want more students living on campus. We have about 27,000 students at Bundoora at the moment, of whom only about 1,600 actually live on campus. We think even in post-COVID times that there's enormous scope to increase the number of students living on site. And there's still enormous demand for on-campus accommodation from students who live too far away from campus to travel conveniently every day. And that's obviously includes international students, but would also include a lot of students from regional Victoria who are a big and important part of our student cohort. So to answer your question then, some aspects of what we do may change, particularly the commercial retail aspects of it, but people will still need housing, and we want to make sure that there's a good range of housing options, both affordable, student and private residential, and we're still very focused on the sport and the health aspects because those are two things that La Trobe excels at. They're two of our strengths that I was talking about earlier on. But this is all part of our unfolding philosophy of being a university that's deeply engaged in the communities that surround it. We know, and this goes to a lot of the questions you've asked, Suresh, I know that there's a lot of suspicion about universities for all the reasons that you've so brilliantly rehearsed. We know that we have to earn and keep earning the trust and goodwill of our community. And we think that the way we will do that is by demonstrating what we can put back into the community through sporting facilities, health facilities, job creation, helping small businesses, medium-sized enterprises get on their feet and make a go of it. So to me, that's going to be the most important thing coming out of COVID for the university sector. I think everyone is now thinking hard, how can we demonstrate our value and our relevance to the Australian nation? That's really the important thing now. How can we help the young people retrain the workforce, work with industry, generate the next wave of economic growth that I'm sure will come in this country? That's the task for universities now, and we are very, very focused on that.
John, this has been one of the most intellectually stimulating conversations that I've ever had. And given your deep knowledge and vast experience, I didn't expect anything less. So I thank you very much. It's been absolutely stimulating, and it's been very informative.
Suresh, can I just say in return, these have been some of the best informed questions I've ever been asked. So your questions have indeed been very probing, but really well put and really well thought out. So thank you very much. I'm really grateful.
It comes from my deep passion for education.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, lovely to meet you.
John. Keep safe and well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you
Bye.
too. You too. Take care. Thanks,
Bye.
mate.